I used to believe that love, like a book, has a beginning, a middle, and an end you could trace your fingers through. I believed my story, my family would follow the same arc. But I was wrong. Sometimes love gets rewritten by someone else's hand. And sometimes that hand belongs to your only child. So before you sit down and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now let me tell you what happened. It all began the year I turned 76. I had been living alone peacefully in my small home in Whitestone for nearly 20 years since retiring from the library. It was filled with books, quiet mornings, and the creaks of the old wood floors I'd grown to love. But then came the stroke. It wasn't devastating. I didn't lose my speech or my memory, but it left my left side weaker, slower. Just enough to remind me every hour that I couldn't do what I used to. I dropped pans. I stumbled more. I needed help dressing. Simple things became Everest. I resisted calling James at first. My son had his own life somewhere between career and finance, and I'm busy mom, and we hadn't been close since his father died 10 years ago. But the truth was, I had no one else. My friends were aging out of independence, and my body was quietly betraying me. When I finally made the call, he didn't even hesitate. "Of course, Mom," he said smoothly. "You come stay with me. I'll take care of everything." At that moment I cried, not from sadness, from the relief of hearing the words stay spoken so warmly. Maybe I thought, this is our moment to rebuild. James arrived 2 days later with a nurse's smile and a rental van. He moved quickly, boxing up the life I'd built, saying, "You don't need all these things, Mom. It's clutter. We'll start fresh." I told myself change would be good. His apartment was spacious enough. He lived alone, had no wife, no kids. He had the time. The first night at his place was quiet. He'd put me in the spare room, bare walls, firm bed, no television. I missed the dusty warmth of my reading nook back home. But James brought me tea, helped me into bed, and kissed my forehead. "It's going to be okay," he said. "You're safe now." That word safe, it stayed with me. It tasted sweet that night. But the next morning, he was gone. There was no breakfast, no morning medication. I waited. The hours blurred. Around noon, I tried calling for him, but my voice cracked from disuse. He returned around 3. "Work emergency," he said casually, dropping a bag of fast food onto the counter. "You're okay, right?" I nodded. What else was I supposed to do? That day became a pattern, then a rhythm, and then a quiet, brutal normal. Breakfast, if it came, was cold toast. Baths were forgotten. My clothing sat in the hamper unwashed. My skin itched from sheets unchanged for weeks. I didn't want to nag. I didn't want to be a burden. So I wrote. In the margins of a half-used journal, I scribbled what I didn't say aloud. He forgot my lunch again. My stomach is a tight knot. I dreamed of soup. 3 days since I bathed. My body smells like old sorrow. He laughed on the phone with someone about buying new speakers. My support check arrived yesterday. Those words were my lifeline. I couldn't speak to anyone about what was happening who would believe that James Alowan, the responsible bachelor son who took in his fragile mother, was neglecting her. Even I didn't want to believe it. The breaking point came one night when I fell. I had gotten up to use the bathroom. My legs buckled. I hit the floor hard, painfully, and lay there for what felt like hours. I crawled back to bed by myself. James never noticed. Not the bruises on my hip. Not the way I limped for days after. Not the swelling in my left wrist. The silence between us grew thicker. He stopped checking on me entirely. Sometimes I didn't see him for a full day. The fridge was often empty. When I mentioned it softly, hesitantly, he rolled his eyes. "You don't eat that much anyway, Mom." And then one evening, as I lay in bed in the dark, I heard him laugh from the living room. He was watching a movie, popcorn in hand. I curled in on myself. I couldn't remember the last time someone had asked if I was okay. The woman I had once been, the librarian who could recite poetry and debate philosophy, was gone, replaced by a frail figure in a dim room, forgotten like an overdue book. No one checked out anymore, but something inside me still flickered. Not rage, not yet, just a small stubborn light. That's when I remembered the old phone, the one I had hidden away in the shoebox of letters I'd packed before the move. I would find it, and I would tell the world. Because even if no one was listening now, they would, one day soon. The next morning, I waited until James left the apartment. He always slammed the door, as if declaring to the world that whatever happened inside wasn't his concern. I shuffled to the closet using the wall as support. My legs ached. My left arm barely responded. But my mind was still mine. I pulled down the old shoebox from the shelf, wincing as the lid slipped and thudded to the floor. Inside it was still there. Nestled among old letters from my sister, a pressed wildflower from my late husband, and a train ticket I never used. The flip phone. It was dusty, forgotten, and scratched from age. But when I held it in my palm, it felt warm, like memory. I opened it slowly, almost reverently, and pressed the power button. A brief pause, a flicker of light, and then the screen blinked awake. No SIM card, no network. But it had a working camera and a voice recorder. That was enough. That night, I waited in silence, letting the stillness wrap around me. James didn't come to say goodnight. He never did anymore. I pressed record and held the phone on my lap. The microphone picked up everything. The growl of my stomach, the distant sound of James laughing at some late-night show, the ache in my voice as I whispered, "It's been 2 days since he last checked on me. I found mold in my water glass. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning." Click. Save. The next day, I placed the phone beneath a stack of magazines on my bedside table, camera lens peeking out toward the doorway. I left it running. It caught him coming in, tossing a bag of chips onto my nightstand without looking me in the eye. "There. Snack. Happy," he muttered. He never looked to see the untouched meals piling in my trash bin, or the bottle of expired medication I hadn't taken because no one refilled it. Click. Save again. This became my new ritual: recording, archiving, documenting. Each clip a timestamp on my pain, each file a future reckoning. Some part of me still wanted to believe he'd come around, that maybe he was overwhelmed, not malicious. But that illusion shattered the day I overheard him on the phone. I had wheeled myself slowly, painfully closer to the hallway to listen. "Nah, man," James chuckled. "I told the caseworker she's doing great. You should see how much they give me for care expenses. Basically free rent. I haven't even bought groceries this week." He laughed. I didn't cry. I felt something colder than tears rise in my chest. Something precise. He was using me, not just forgetting me, not just neglecting me. He was stealing from me, from the system, from the memory of my husband who'd worked 40 years to leave something behind, from the woman I had been, respected, independent human. He saw me as a check in the mail and a bed he didn't have to pay for. That night, I recorded myself again. He's not just forgetting, he's feeding off me. This is no longer neglect. This is theft. Days passed. I saved everything. I wrote time codes on scrap paper. I listed each moment, the skipped meals, the cold insults, the bruises from falls he never asked about. There were times I doubted myself. Was I being dramatic? Paranoid? But then I looked around at the state of my room, the damp towel still on the floor from 3 days ago, the sour smell from the pile of clothes in the corner, the hunger that gnawed at me like a second heartbeat. No, I wasn't imagining this. And yet, every time a family member called, he intercepted the phone. "She's resting. She's in the bath. She's doing great. Just tired." He told the world I was fine while I sat in a prison made of apathy. And then, like a cruel twist of irony, came the invitation. Thanksgiving dinner. He printed out invitations to family, cousins, aunts, nieces I hadn't seen in years. "Wouldn't it be nice," he said, "for everyone to see how well you're doing?" He cleaned my room for the first time in weeks, washed the sheets, gave me a proper meal that night, brushed my hair, smiled. It was all for show. A stage set to convince the world that James Elwyn was the golden son. But I had the script he didn't know about. I looked at the phone. I looked at my notebook, at my bruises, and I knew what I had to do. I began planning. I would wait until Thanksgiving, and then I'd expose it all. Not with rage, not with yelling, but with the quiet, devastating truth he'd helped me record. I'd turn Thanksgiving, the day he tried to parade me like a prize, into the day I reclaimed my dignity, because he'd forgotten the most dangerous part of a story. The quiet character is always the one who's been watching. The week before Thanksgiving, James transformed into a different person. Suddenly, there were groceries in the fridge, milk that hadn't expired, fruit that wasn't bruised. He even made breakfast twice, bringing it to me with a theatrical flair. See? Just like old times, Mom. He cleaned the apartment like he was staging a home for sale, bleaching the floors, fluffing the couch pillows, even lighting candles that smelled like pumpkin and vanilla. But I saw the cracks, the rehearsed smile, the edge in his voice whenever I asked a question. He wasn't doing this out of care. He was preparing a performance, and I was the reluctant co-star. He told the family I was thriving, gaining strength, so grateful. I could only guess how many lies he'd stacked up. But I stayed quiet. I let him paint his illusion because I was painting something of my own. In the evenings when he left the apartment to pick up party supplies or grab a drink, I replayed the recordings. I labeled each clip. I made a chart, time, date, what happened. I had footage of him throwing a bag of takeout onto my lap, of him stepping over a fallen medication bottle without glancing down, of him laughing on the couch while I coughed in my room for over an hour. I selected the most damning ones and compiled them onto a USB I hid inside the base of an old ceramic lamp. But I needed more than evidence. I needed an ally. And I knew exactly who to trust: my niece Ava. She was 23, curious, quiet, and sharp as a razor. We'd always shared a bond. She used to spend weekends at my place as a girl, reading mystery novels while I served tea and cookies. I hadn't spoken to her since I moved in with James, because he hadn't let me, but she'd be at Thanksgiving, and I'd find a way. The morning of Thanksgiving, James dressed me like a mannequin. "Let's get you looking presentable," he said, brushing my hair too hard, forcing a cardigan over my arms. He chose a long skirt to hide the bruises on my legs, dabbed concealer under my eyes, and smiled at the mirror. "There we go, my beautiful mother." His hands lingered on my shoulders just a second too long. "You're going to behave today, right?" I nodded. I always nodded. At noon, the guests began to arrive. I could hear their laughter, the clinking of dishes, the chatter of relatives catching up. James ushered them in with wide grins and fake warmth. He poured wine, made toasts, told everyone how proud he was to care for me. "Mom's a fighter," he said, slapping my shoulder gently. "She's come a long way." They clapped. I smiled. The performance had begun. Ava arrived just after 1 p.m. She was taller now, with her mother's eyes and her father's gentle step. When she saw me, her expression flickered just for a moment from joy to something sharper. She saw through the mask. She hugged me tightly. I whispered into her ear. Later, on the balcony, it was all I could manage. She pulled back, nodded imperceptibly, and smiled like nothing was wrong. The rest of the afternoon passed in agonizing slow motion. James made sure I was seated in the center of the living room like a trophy. He snapped photos with guests beside me. 3 generations of Eloans, he said to one cousin. I promised Dad I'd look after her. Each word made my stomach turn. But I endured, because I was waiting for one moment. The balcony. After dinner, when everyone lounged with pie and coffee, I excused myself. James narrowed his eyes but let me go. I stepped outside into the crisp air and waited. Minutes passed. Then Ava slipped out beside me. "Tell me everything," she said softly. I handed her the phone first. "I've recorded everything I whispered. He's not a caregiver. He's a thief. And a liar." Her hands trembled slightly as she held it. "I need you to do one thing," I said. "Take this to someone who will believe it. Police. A lawyer. A journalist, I don't care who. Just don't give it back to him." She blinked, stunned. "He did this to you." Her voice cracked. "All this time." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She hugged me again, harder this time. Then I gave her the USB too, in case the phone breaks. "That lamp in my room. The base unscrews. It's inside." She looked at me with the kind of eyes that don't belong to a 23-year-old. They belonged to someone who had just seen behind the curtain of what people were capable of. "I've got you," she said. "I swear." And she walked back in like nothing had happened. The rest of the evening blurred. James poured more drinks. Someone played a piano melody. Laughter, warmth, oblivion. Until there was a knock on the door. 3 knocks. Firm. James frowned and walked over, still holding a glass of wine. When he opened the door, 2 uniformed officers stood outside. "James Eloan." "Yes. We need you to come with us." Confusion. Chuckles from the guests. What is this? A prank? He asked, still smiling. Then one of the officers pulled out a tablet and hit play. A video began to play, and suddenly the room went silent. The silence that fell in that room was not ordinary. It was thick, cold, hollow. The kind of silence that replaces laughter with dread. Every guest froze as the tablet speaker played my voice, quiet, cracked, unmistakably mine. He hasn't brought food in 2 days. I'm shaking. I drank tap water and it made me sick. Then footage. Me hunched over in my bed, whispering through the dark. A timestamp blinking in the corner. My room dim, unkempt, barely human. The sound of a television playing somewhere distant. James stared at the screen like it had betrayed him. His fingers twitched at his side. For the first time in months, I saw fear in his face. Real fear. The second video rolled. James walking past my room, stepping over a fallen pill bottle without stopping. My voice again. I cried out. He didn't answer. I think he heard. I think he didn't care. One cousin gasped. Aunt Gloria clutched her chest. Ava from the far end of the room didn't move a muscle. James finally stammered, This is out of context. She's confused. She's sick. But the next video left no room for denial. James speaking into his phone, grinning. Now, man, she doesn't need much. I just tell the caseworker she's improving. They keep sending the checks. It's basically free money. A collective breath was sucked from the room like a window had shattered. The officers stepped forward. Mr. Elowin, you are under investigation for elder abuse, neglect, and fraud. We're placing you under temporary custody while the investigation proceeds. James dropped his glass. It shattered on the hardwood. He looked around the room like someone had pulled the floor out from under him. Are you all serious? He laughed desperately now. You believe this old bat over me? He turned toward me, eyes wild. She's senile. She doesn't know what she's saying. And that's when I stood. I don't know how. I hadn't stood without support in weeks. My legs shook. My spine screamed. But I rose slowly, steadily, until I was facing him. No, I said. My voice was firm, cold, unshakable. You just hoped I wouldn't say anything. Gasps. No one had heard me speak like that in a long time. Not because I couldn't, but because I wasn't allowed. The officer gently placed a hand on James's arm, cuffing him with practiced ease. He didn't fight. He looked too stunned. Or maybe he finally realized there was no script left to improvise. As they read him his rights, he muttered under his breath, ungrateful. After everything I did for her, it was almost laughable. Almost. I watched as they led him out the front door. His guests, our family, parted in stunned silence. No one moved to stop it. No one defended him. Because in those videos, they hadn't just seen neglect. They'd seen cruelty. And cruelty is hard to unsee. The moment the door closed behind him, the entire room turned toward me. I felt a dozen eyes on my back, but I didn't flinch. Ava was the first to move. She came to my side, holding my arm like I was made of porcelain. Do you want to sit? She whispered. I nodded. She helped me back to the couch, fluffing the pillow behind me, tucking a throw over my legs. A soft maternal gesture. Reversed roles. A few others began murmuring apologies one by one. I'm so sorry, Margaret. I had no idea. Why didn't you say anything? I didn't answer. Not out of resentment, just exhaustion. I looked around at the half-eaten pie slices, the untouched coffee mugs, the room still scented with cinnamon and candle wax. And I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was being seen, not as a burden, not as a monthly check, not as something to hide, but as a woman, as a witness, as someone who had endured and survived. Later that night, Ava helped me into bed, not out of obligation, but out of love. She placed the phone and notebook on my bedside table and smiled. I'll stay the night, she said. You shouldn't be alone. I nodded, unable to speak. The silence now wasn't hollow. It was warm, peaceful. And just before I drifted to sleep, I whispered something I hadn't said in months. Thank you. She squeezed my hand. I'm just glad you spoke. And in the hush of that night, I realized something. Speaking saved me. Not screaming, not begging, but recording the truth, letting it sit in the dark until it was time to shine. My name is Margaret Elowin, and this Thanksgiving I didn't serve turkey. I serve the truth. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the floor like it had never dared to before. The apartment, still cluttered with Thanksgiving remnants, felt unfamiliar in its silence. Not oppressive, just emptied. Like something toxic had been lifted. James was gone. Not just physically. Gone in the way that changes the oxygen in a room. The echo of his voice, the slam of his steps, the weight of his silence, they had all haunted the walls. Now there was nothing but space. Ava was already awake. She'd brewed coffee and made oatmeal, placing both on a tray beside my bed. It had been so long since someone had made me breakfast without a scowl, without expecting praise or repayment, that I almost didn't know how to receive it. But Ava, being Ava, didn't push. She simply sat by my side and said, "You don't have to eat it now. Just know it's here." And in those small, quiet words, I felt a warmth I hadn't known in months. After breakfast, a knock at the door startled us both. Not loud, not urgent, just steady. Ava opened it, and standing there was Officer Dana Wells, the same woman who'd helped escort James out. She was kind-eyed with a clipped, steady tone. "Mrs. Alawan," she greeted me with surprising gentleness. "Do you feel up to answering a few questions today? We'd like to start formal proceedings, but only if you're ready." I nodded. "I've been ready. I just needed someone to ask." We sat in the kitchen, me at the table, Ava beside me, Officer Wells across from us with a notepad and a digital recorder. She asked questions in soft but clear tones. When did the neglect begin? What support payments did your son have access to? Did you ever feel in danger? I answered everything. I didn't cry, because this wasn't mourning. This was testimony. I showed her the journal, the phone, the USB. Each item was bagged and labeled, handled like sacred objects. And in a way, they were the physical proof of everything I'd lived through and everything James had tried to bury. When she left, she turned to me and said something I'll never forget. "You're stronger than most people I know." I didn't believe her at the time, but the words stayed. Later that afternoon, a social worker named Clarice visited. She was warm with silver braids and a clipboard full of resources. "We'll find you a new place to stay, Margaret," she promised. "A clean, safe place, private but with support. You won't be left alone again." The relief I felt was not the kind that rushes in like a wave. It was slow, gentle, like an old coat being draped over cold shoulders. That evening, Ava helped me pack a few of my things, only what mattered. Photos, books, my journal, my clothes. The rest could rot with the lies James had built this place on. Before we left, I stood at the threshold of my room. This room that had been both prison and sanctuary. The place where I wept. The place where I wrote. The place where I recorded my truth in the dark and prayed someone would one day hear it. I touched the windowsill, ran a hand over the lamp where the USB had been hidden, and closed my eyes. Goodbye, I thought. Not to the room, not to the pain, but to the silence. The dangerous kind, the kind that lets cruelty fester. I left it behind. The transitional housing was small but clean. Quiet! A nurse visited every morning. My meals were warm and plated, not dumped on a tray. There were other women like me, some younger, some older, all with stories they carried in their bones. And I found slowly that telling mine helped. There was one woman, Delia, whose daughter had stolen her retirement fund. Another, Myra, whose caregiver grandson locked her in a basement to protect her from crime. We were an unlikely sorority, but we laughed. We wept. We understood each other in ways the outside world rarely did. Weeks passed. Then one morning, Clarice returned with a thick envelope. She sat across from me, hands folded. "James Alawan has been formally charged," she said. "Elder abuse, fraud, neglect. His case will likely proceed to trial, but he's currently in county jail. He's not contesting the evidence." I stared at the envelope. "He pled guilty," she nodded. "Your videos, they were undeniable. No jury would overlook that." My hands trembled, not from weakness this time, but release. I wasn't just heard. I was believed. 1 week later, I was offered a place in a long-term residential community by the sea. Quiet gardens, a library, sunlight in every room. When Ava came to help me settle in, she wheeled my small suitcase into the apartment and looked around. "This place suits you," she said. Bright. Peaceful. I smiled. For the first time in months, I felt something return to me. Not just dignity, not just health, but personhood. I looked out the window at the sea breeze stirring the trees and whispered, I'm home. The first night in my new home, I didn't sleep much. Not from fear or discomfort, but from the sheer unfamiliarity of peace. No banging doors. No harsh footsteps pacing the hallway. No muttered curses behind thin walls. Only the distant sound of waves, the rustling of trees, and the gentle creak of a ceiling fan above me. My body was still sore from months of neglect, but it finally had permission to relax. My soul, on the other hand, was adjusting to freedom. Ava had left a note on my nightstand before she left. You're the strongest woman I know. Call me anytime. I pressed the paper to my chest like it was medicine. In the morning, I awoke to sunlight already filling the room, not blocked by blackout curtains or filtered through grime, but open, clear, golden. It touched my skin like a second chance. Breakfast was delivered on a tray. Scrambled eggs toast with butter, a slice of orange. A real meal plated with care. A cup of hot tea sat beside it, steeping slowly. I cried over that tea, not loudly, just a few quiet tears down my cheeks. Because it wasn't the food. It was the dignity of being served with intention, without resentment. That kind of kindness felt foreign, but I was ready to welcome it back. Later that day, I explored the community grounds with a nurse named Sophia. She was soft-spoken, probably younger than James, with a listening heart. As we passed the gardens, she said, "You don't have to talk about what brought you here, Margaret, but when you're ready, someone will always be here to listen." I paused beside a bench and smiled gently. "I've already told my story," I said. "Now I think I'd rather listen to others for a while." She nodded and we sat. From that day forward, I became part of the rhythm here. Not a patient, not a burden, a neighbor, a woman, a survivor. Every Tuesday, I joined the community's reading circle. On Thursdays, we had poetry workshops. I even found myself reading aloud again, my voice scratchy from disuse but strong. Words returned to me like old friends. I wrote letters to Ava, too. Real ones. Longhand. She wrote back faithfully, sometimes with photos, sometimes with doodles of me reading on a park bench, or sketches of the sea beyond my new window. We had become something new to each other, not just aunt and niece, something deeper, something chosen. One afternoon in late January, I received a package from her. Inside was a small hardcover book with a linen cover. The title read, The Quiet Room, a true story of survival and silence. It was my story. She'd taken the recordings, my journals, my notes, and with my blessing, she'd compiled them into something for the world to read. She didn't write it as a tell-all. She wrote it as a tribute. Inside the first page, she'd scrawled in pen, "For every woman whose silence was mistaken for surrender." I held the book against my chest, closed my eyes, and felt the strength in my own stillness. It was the first time I believed that what had happened to me hadn't been in vain, because I knew someone somewhere would read that story and see themselves. And maybe they too would find the courage to record, to speak, to rise. Weeks passed. One afternoon, as I sat on a bench near the lavender hedges, a woman named Joy, newly admitted, sat beside me. She was quiet, shaky. Her eyes darted from side to side like someone still living in fear. "You're Margaret, right?" she whispered. I nodded. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a small battered flip phone, just like mine. "I heard about what you did," she said. "I thought I was the only one." I looked at her, saw myself in the shadows of her face. "You're not alone," I said softly. She exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath for years. And then I realized, this wasn't just healing. This was purpose. I wasn't here to disappear. I was here to light a path. Spring came early that year. The cherry trees outside my window bloomed in soft waves of pink and white. And for the first time in a long time, I marked the passage of time by something other than pain. In this new chapter of life, healing didn't come in grand revelations. It came slowly like petals falling from a branch. Gentle, patient, silent. Every morning, I walked the garden path with my cane, breathing in the salty air that rolled in from the ocean. My legs still ached, and sometimes my balance wavered, but I walked anyway. Every step was an act of defiance against the months I'd spent confined and neglected. Every breath was a rebellion against the silence that had once swallowed me whole. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming the small rituals I'd once taken for granted. At the reading circle, people began asking me to share more of my writing. Not the story of James. No, that book had already made its rounds, but reflections, letters, little poems. I was hesitant at first, unsure if my words still held power without pain behind them. But then one day I read aloud a letter I had written to my younger self. Dear Margaret, they will not always love you well. Some will use your kindness as a ladder. Others will ignore your hunger as if it were invisible. But you must remember who you are. You are not forgotten. You are not voiceless. You are not theirs. You are the keeper of your own name. You are the author of your silence. And when you speak again, it will echo. When I finished, the room was still. One of the women, Lillian, who rarely spoke during meetings, wiped a tear from her cheek. You wrote that for all of us, she said. And perhaps I had. It was in that moment I understood what had been quietly forming inside me since the day James was led away in cuffs. A calling. Not for vengeance, not for pity, but for voice. For those whose lives had been quietly erased behind closed doors. For those whose caregivers wore masks of benevolence while draining them of dignity. For every woman who'd been left behind by a son, a husband, a world that only valued her while she served. So I asked the center if I could start something new. We called it the Quiet Collective. Every Tuesday evening we gathered in the main room, a group of women, some in wheelchairs, some with trembling hands, all with stories. We wrote, we read aloud. We remembered ourselves, eh? Some wrote poetry. Some wrote letters they'd never send. Others just spoke, and someone else wrote for them. But week after week we built something sacred. A sanctuary of truth, and word of it spread. A local journalist heard about our group and asked if she could visit. At first we said no. We didn't want pity pieces or tragic profiles. But she was different. She listened. And when she wrote, she didn't make us victims. She made us visible. The article, The Silent Rebellion of Margaret Ilawen and the Quiet Collective, was published in spring. It made waves. Donations came in. Volunteers, therapists, books, voice recorders for those with arthritis. One woman who read the article sent us 10 notebooks with leather covers embossed with the word resilient. And Ava visited every Sunday. We had a ritual now. She brought me jasmine tea, I shared new writing, and we walked the garden path together, shoulder to shoulder. One day, as we sat on a bench watching the sun set behind the hedges, she turned to me and said, "You know, I used to think you were quiet because you were afraid." I raised an eyebrow. "And now," she smiled, "now I know you were just gathering strength." That night, I lay in bed and looked out the window at the stars. I thought about the woman I had been 6 months ago, tucked in a dark room, begging in silence for food, afraid of her own son. And I thought about the woman I was now, not fully healed, but wholly alive. There were still echoes of James, of course. The investigation had made headlines in our region. He'd pled guilty to financial fraud and elder neglect and received a reduced sentence through a plea deal. He was barred from working in any caregiving capacity ever again. He hadn't tried to contact me, and I didn't want him to. Some chapters don't get closure. They just get turned. And mine was just beginning. 3 months into spring, something extraordinary happened. I received an invitation. It was printed on thick ivory cardstock and embossed with gold lettering. At the top, the emblem of the State Commission for Elder Advocacy glinted in the light. Beneath it, the words, "In recognition of Margaret Ilawen's courage, resilience, and impact on the protection of elder rights and dignity, we are honored to invite you to speak at the annual Advocacy and Reform Summit hosted in Washington, D.C." I read the letter 3 times before the meaning sank in. They weren't just acknowledging my suffering. They were asking me to speak to share it. Ava, who had come to visit that evening, squealed with joy. "Do you know what this means, Aunt Margaret? You're being heard at the highest level. You're changing things." But I hesitated. Me. Speak at a summit, in front of politicians and experts and legal minds. I'm just a librarian. I said softly. No, she replied, taking my hand. You're a lighthouse. The flight to Washington was long and tiring, but they made every arrangement seamless. A wheelchair at the terminal, a direct flight, a warm welcome at the hotel. The organizers treated me like royalty, but not the distant kind, like a woman whose words mattered. The morning of the summit, I dressed in my favorite blouse, a soft sky blue one that matched the early blooms of spring, and pinned a small silver locket to my collar. Inside it, a photo of Ava as a child, and next to it, a tiny folded piece of paper that simply read, "You are the author of your silence." I carried that reminder with me onto the stage. The hall was filled with people, advocates, caregivers, doctors, survivors. And as I wheeled myself up to the podium, my heart thudded against my ribs. But when I looked out at them, I didn't see strangers. I saw Joy. I saw Delia. I saw every woman in the quiet collective. I saw Ava watching from the front row with tears in her eyes. And I spoke. My voice was low at first, fragile, careful. But as I continued, it grew steadier, fuller, like someone walking into their own home for the first time in years. When my son became my caregiver, I thought I was safe. I thought love was enough. But neglect does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it wears the mask of duty, and sometimes it looks like a family photo that hides the truth behind smiles. I told them everything, not just about James, but about the silence, the hesitation to ask for help, the fear of not being believed, the nights I lay in bed wondering if I had become invisible. And then I told them about the moment I pressed record. The room was silent, and then came the applause. Not polite, not rehearsed, raw. It rolled through the hall like thunder. I felt it in my bones. After the speech, people lined up to speak with me. Some just wanted to shake my hand. Some wanted to share their own stories. One woman whispered, "You gave me permission to speak." Another slipped a note into my palm. "My daughter hasn't let me outside in 3 years. I'm going home today, and I'm calling a lawyer." That night, I sat alone in the hotel room, staring out at the city lights. I thought about what Ava had said. "You're a lighthouse." And I finally believed it. Not because I had sought to be seen, but because in shining my truth, I had given others a reason to find theirs. When I returned to the center, the other women welcomed me like a soldier returning from battle. "Did you show them who we are?" Lillian asked. I smiled. "I didn't have to." They already knew. We expanded the quiet collective that month, added a second weekly meeting, invited speakers, started a newsletter. People began sending letters from all over the country, survivors, daughters, social workers. The community center set up a small library in my name, the Margaret Allow and Resilience Room. Ava cried when she saw it. "I knew you'd change the world," she said. I laughed through tears. "I just wanted someone to hear me." She shook her head. "They did more than hear you. They listened." And so I kept speaking. Not just at summits, but in coffee shops, community halls, online interviews. I told the truth so many times it stopped feeling like a wound and started feeling like a door. Everywhere I went, I met women who had survived what I had survived. And men too. Quiet, trembling, ashamed. We shared a kind of knowing that couldn't be taught. And one by one, we started to believe again, not in institutions, not in systems, but in each other. The following summer was the most vibrant I'd known in years. Sunlight poured through the community garden, painting everything gold. The lavender bloomed taller than ever. The roses opened like they were exhaling. Even the wind seemed to have softened, no longer a reminder of cold nights or unanswered calls, but something playful, gentle, present. Each morning began the same. Tea by the window, a walk with Ava or Sophia, and a writing hour in the resilience room. But that season, something new stirred in me. Purpose had found its rhythm. Now it was time for legacy. One Thursday afternoon, as I sat in the resilience room, a younger woman, perhaps in her early 40s, knocked gently and entered. She wore a faded denim jacket and held a notebook pressed tight to her chest. "Mrs. Elowen?" she asked, unsure. I nodded. "My name is Kelsey," she said. I read your story last month. I'm not a caregiver. I'm a daughter. My mom, she's with someone now. A man who says he's helping her, but she calls me crying. Says she's cold. That she misses soup. That word, soup. It was always the simple things. She sat across from me, her hands trembling. I don't know what to do. No one listens. Everyone says she's lucky to have someone. They don't see what I see. I didn't offer advice right away. I listened. And when she finished, I leaned in gently and said, "Does your mother have a phone?" "Yes." "Then teach her how to record." Her eyes widened. "You think it'll matter?" I nodded. "Not because people don't believe words, but because proof silences doubt." She exhaled. That night, I added something to our quiet collective charter. A section called the Watchlight Protocol. It wasn't complicated. Just a set of tools. Ethical, simple, compassionate for documenting subtle abuse and reaching out without alerting the abuser. We taught members how to set up automatic backups, hide apps, in plain sight log incidents with timestamps, and even how to send messages using grocery lists or inside books. We weren't just telling stories anymore. We were creating a movement. In late July, we received a letter from a law clinic that had read about our program in the paper. "We've seen a 40% increase in elder abuse reporting since your story aired. We would be honored to collaborate on a legal guide with your group for survivors and their families." I stared at the page. 40%. My breath caught in my throat, not from fear, but awe. So many people had been silent. Now they were stepping into the light. We began compiling our guide. Stories, resources, flowcharts, templates. We called it The Quiet Rebellion, a survivor's handbook. Ava took on the design. Delia edited stories for clarity. I wrote the introduction. It read, "This is not a book of vengeance. It is a lantern, a guide for those navigating the darkness, whispered through the voices of those who once whispered alone." We printed 500 copies, then 5,000. By the time fall arrived, the Quiet Collective had chapters in 4 states. Women Skyped in from nursing homes, daughters from city apartments, men from shelters, sisters, friends, neighbors, all once invisible, now connected. One night, sitting by the window, Ava asked, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't recorded anything?" I looked out into the dusk where the last rays of sun painted the sea orange. "I would have disappeared," I said. She didn't speak for a moment, then whispered, "I'm so glad you didn't." So was I. That same month, I received one final envelope from the court. Inside was a printed notice. The People versus James Elowin. Sentence upheld. I stared at it for a long time. He had appealed his sentence, tried to claim emotional stress, financial hardship, anything that would cast him as a misguided man rather than a manipulator. But the judge had seen through him. The appeal was denied. The last line read, "The defendant remains barred from any power of attorney, fiduciary access, or elder care employment for life." I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into a drawer, not with rage, but with closure. I didn't need revenge. I had something stronger. Justice. That weekend, I spoke at our 5th Quiet Collective Summit. This one hosted right in our garden beneath the fluttering white tents and blooming roses. People traveled across state lines just to attend. Some wore pins with the word unseen. Others brought letters to read, testimonies, poems, voice recordings. One woman, nearly 80, walked slowly to the microphone and said, "I didn't speak for 15 years. Today, I brought the journal I started last week, because Margaret reminded me it's never too late." I wept for her, and for every woman who would never know our names, but would still feel our ripple. This was no longer my story. It was ours. As summer gave way to autumn, the leaves in our garden began to shift, burnished golds, ember reds, dusky ochres. There was something symbolic about it. Shedding the old, but not with regret, with grace. I'd always loved fall. As a librarian, I used to say, autumn was the season when stories came alive, when people finally slowed down long enough to feel something real. Now I live that rhythm. Each week brought letters from new survivors, some from women in shelters, some from men whose daughters had forged signatures, some anonymous, typed with only one line, "You gave me the courage to speak." The movement we started was growing bigger than we'd ever imagined. That month, a documentary team reached out. They'd seen our summit footage, read Ava's book, and wanted to create a short film about the Quiet Collective. At first, I was hesitant. Cameras felt invasive. The lens can be both a magnifier and a manipulator. But after a long walk through the garden with Ava, I agreed. If even one woman sees it, I said and whispers to herself, that's me. Then it's worth it. The filming process was both strange and cathartic. They captured our writing circles, our laughter, our silences. They interviewed women like Joy, who now ran her own support group at a local church, and Lillian, who had begun hosting Sunday poetry readings over Zoom. They filmed me walking the path I once could barely stand on. They asked me questions that no one had ever dared before. What do you miss most from the life you had before James became your caregiver? I paused. Being able to need something, I said, without being punished for it. That line made it into the trailer. When the documentary premiered online, it exploded. Thousands of views overnight. Shares. Comments. Women tagged their mothers, daughters, aunts. Watch this. This is us. I never knew how to explain what I went through until now. And in the middle of it all, James's name became irrelevant. He was no longer the story. That fall, I was invited to a televised town hall on elder rights. It was live in audience, a panel and questions from viewers. Midway through the program, a woman stood up, maybe in her early 30s. She looked nervous but determined. My grandmother lives with us, she said. She never complains. She just sits in her chair and says she's fine, but she's quieter than she used to be. And I never thought to ask if something was wrong. I just assumed. She trailed off. I leaned toward the mic. Assumption is how silence survives, I said. But a question, just one question asked kindly, can be the crack that lets the truth breathe. She nodded through tears. After the show, a producer handed me a handwritten note from a backstage assistant. It read, "My mom's caregiver has been leaving bruises. I didn't know what to call it, but now I do. Thank you." I folded the note and placed it in my purse beside Ava's first letter. They belonged together. In October, the Quiet Collective launched its first scholarship fund, the Dignity Grant. Funded by donations from the documentary and readers of Ava's book, it was small at first, just enough to help a few survivors relocate, hire legal help, or cover the cost of therapy. But by the end of the month, the fund had grown tenfold. One woman used it to escape her grandson who had locked her in her room each night. Another used it to regain control of her finances after years of silent theft. Each story felt like a spark. And I realized we weren't just reacting anymore. We were reshaping the future. One evening, sitting under the twinkle lights strung above the courtyard, Ava asked me something I hadn't expected. "Do you ever think about forgiving him?" James. His name hadn't come up in weeks. I took a long breath. "I don't know," I said honestly. Forgiveness used to feel like a destination. Now it feels like a landscape I visit sometimes. I walk around it. I look at the trees. I sit with it. But I haven't built a house there. She nodded. That makes sense. We fell into silence. A peaceful one. Then she said, "Do you think he watches all of this?" I didn't answer. Because maybe he did. Or maybe he didn't. But it didn't matter. What mattered was this. He no longer had the power to narrate me. I was no longer his story. I was mine. Later that night, I wrote a letter. Not to James. Not to the court. To the version of myself who had once sat in that dark room too afraid to speak. Dear Margaret, you were never small. You were made to bloom. And though the world tried to bury you in its shadows, you grew anyway. Quietly, defiantly, gloriously. Love me. Winter arrived like a hush falling over the garden. Frost traced delicate lace patterns across the windows, and the sea beyond turned steely gray. Its waves quieter now, less fury, more rhythm. I watched them each morning from my chair tea in hand-wool blanket over my knees. And still the letters came. From everywhere. One from Nova Scotia, an older man whose niece had stolen his pension. Another from Arizona, a woman whose daughter confiscated her keys and cut her off from the world. One from South Korea, handwritten, translated by a volunteer. Your story gave me the courage to run away. Each letter became a thread in something vast, something sacred. A quilt of truths long denied. We hung them in the resilience room. Ava called it the wall of witness. Every square inch of it breathed with testimony. Sometimes we would sit silently in front of it and read them aloud one by one. a ritual of presence, of acknowledgement, because one of the cruelties of being mistreated by those you love is the way the world refuses to believe it. But here, we believed. That December I turned 77. They threw me a small party just the way I liked it. Real cake, no candles, flowers from the winter greenhouse, a song on the piano by Joy's granddaughter. Ava read me a poem she'd written called What Grows After. And in the middle of the celebration, the director of the center stood up with a small box in his hand. Inside, it was a medal, a state-level honor, the Beacon of Dignity Award, for contributions to elder advocacy, survivor empowerment, and legislative reform. I stared at it, heavy gold, etched with laurel branches, and felt something shift deep in my chest. Not pride, not victory, a strange, full kind of grief, because I remembered what had begun it all. A dark room, a missed meal, a son who didn't see me as human. It was hard to reconcile those two realities, the woman who once crawled to the bathroom in silence, and the woman now being honored for her voice. I accepted the medal, but in my heart I gave it to every woman who hadn't lived long enough to tell her story. A few days later, we had our final quiet collective circle of the year. There were candles on the tables, cinnamon tea in every mug, scarves draped over shoulders. Sophia brought out a box she'd been saving. Inside, small notebooks each with a name embossed on the cover. Your stories, she said, deserve to be carried with dignity. They weren't blank. Each notebook had a line from that person's own writings engraved on the inside cover. Mine read, I wasn't rescued. I recorded myself and called it survival. I ran my fingers over the words. They no longer hurt. They felt true. That night, as snow drifted softly beyond the window, I took out one of the many letters I'd received. It was unsigned. No return address. Just one line written in tight, careful cursive. My son did what yours did, but I was too afraid, so I live through you. Please never stop. I folded it slowly and placed it inside my notebook. I wouldn't stop, because even in the deepest silence, someone was always listening. And if I kept speaking, if we all did, maybe we could make the world quieter, not through fear, but through justice. On New Year's Eve, we gathered in the garden beneath strings of paper lanterns. Each woman held a candle. We'd written wishes or memories or names on slips of biodegradable paper and placed them into a shallow bowl. Ava read them aloud one by one. For my mother, who never spoke, but always knew. For my sister, who found her voice in poetry. For myself, I forgive the silence. Then we lit the bowl on fire. The flames danced. The smoke curled into the winter air, and for a moment, everything was still. I looked around at the women beside me, some with walkers, some with oxygen tanks, some with trembling hands, and saw not survivors, but warriors. We had rebuilt our identities from the ash of shame. And together we had lit a path, one I would walk for the rest of my days, one I hoped others would follow. The new year unfolded gently like fresh pages turning themselves. January brought soft rains and sleepy mornings. The garden slumbered under pale skies, but indoors, the quiet collective bloomed. New members arrived weekly now, referrals from shelters, clinics, even pastors. Survivors who had hidden in plain sight for decades were finding their way to us as if something silent but sacred was guiding them here. We were no longer a group. We were an ecosystem. One Thursday morning, Sophia asked if I'd consider mentoring one of the new members, a woman named Ruth. She's been quiet since arriving, Sophia said gently. But she's reading your book, cover to cover, every day. So I invited Ruth to walk with me. She was tall, bony, with thinning hair pulled into a loose braid. She didn't speak much, but her eyes darted around nervously, always scanning. Trauma does that. It keeps you alert long after the danger is gone. We walked in silence for 3 days before she finally spoke. Do they ever believe you? Who? I asked. People. When you tell them your son hurt you. I paused. Not always. But I don't need all of them to believe me. Just one is enough to crack the silence. She nodded, her mouth twisting slightly. My son locked me in a laundry room for a week. Said I was safer there. My heart clenched. And still, I didn't rush to comfort her. I knew what she needed first. To be heard. So I said simply, tell me what it smelled like. She blinked. What? In the laundry room. What did it smell like? She paused. Mold, dryer sheets, and onions. He left a sack in the corner and forgot about it. I nodded. And how did you sleep? On a pile of towels. They were damp. Her voice began to sharpen like a pencil that hadn't been used in years, finally dragged across paper. Every detail she gave me was a door. And through those doors, her memory returned, not just of the trauma, but of herself. The part of her that had survived. That night, Ruth wrote her first journal entry in years. My name is Ruth, and my silence has expired. We pinned it to the wall of witness the next morning. February brought a storm that knocked out power for a day. The staff lit candles, bundled us in quilts, and served soup made on a gas stove. It could have been an inconvenience. Instead, it became a story. We gathered in the common room wrapped in scarves and shadows and told ghost stories, family secrets, even bad love poems from our youth. I shared a letter I'd written to myself at 50. You think survival means being quiet? One day you'll learn survival means being loud enough to wake the dead. Joy laughed so hard she nearly spilled her cocoa. Delia clapped, shouting, testify. In that moment, I realized something strange. I was happy. Not just grateful, not just relieved. Happy. Later that month, Ava came to me with news. A podcast had reached out, one of the top shows in the country. They wanted to interview me for a series on hidden America stories of injustice that rarely get airtime. I don't know, Ava. I hesitated. It's all been so much already. But she smiled, crouched beside my chair, and said, You once told me the quietest voice can still echo through mountains. This is a mountain, Aunt Margaret. So I agreed. The interview was raw. The host asked about James, about the bruises, about the hunger. But more than that, she asked about power. What does power mean to you now? I answered. Power isn't in revenge. It's in survival. It's not yelling. It's enduring. Power is a woman who records herself in the dark and whispers, I am still here. The episode went viral. Over 1 million downloads in the first week. The hashtag I am still here began trending, used by survivors around the globe. Women in wheelchairs, men in isolation, young people abandoned by systems that never saw them. We created a page where they could upload their own voice recordings. We called it the Archive of the Unheard. It became a mosaic of truth. One night, Ava sat with me and played a woman in Detroit whispering, My daughter says I'm worthless, but I made her from my own body. A man in rural Kansas crying, I gave my grandson everything. He gave me silence. A teenage girl in London saying my grandmother raised me. This is for her. Each voice was a lifeline connecting strangers across oceans of pain, and I realized for the first time in my life that my voice had made a world bigger than the one I had lost. Toward the end of February, Ruth came to me again. Her hair was clean, pulled into a firm ponytail. Her hands no longer shook. I'd like to teach a class, she said. On what? I asked. She smiled a little mischievously. On building emergency kits. Real ones. With flashlights, legal contacts, burner phones, and granola bars. I laughed. Practical and poetic. I love it. She nodded. Because survival isn't just spiritual. Sometimes it's peanut butter and a backup plan. We posted a sign-up sheet that afternoon. The class filled in under an hour. Because the truth is this. Once you've reclaimed your voice, the next step is to help others protect theirs. That winter, we didn't just survive the dark. We lit it up. Together. March arrived with thawing winds and soft promise. The garden slowly stirred back to life. Tiny crocuses breached the soil like timid witnesses, and the cherry trees bare just weeks ago began forming pale green buds along their branches. Renewal, it seemed, was not just seasonal, it was cellular. By now, the quiet collective had grown into something none of us had dared to imagine. It had chapters in 12 states. A national helpline operated from the old church 2 blocks away, run entirely by trained survivors. The Archive of the Unheard had amassed over 4,000 voice submissions in multiple languages, and our Resilience Guidebook. It had just been translated into Spanish and Vietnamese, with Swahili and Arabic on the way. We'd become a movement that moved. But that spring, I received something unexpected. A letter. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable. Elegant cursive slanted slightly left formed with a fountain pen. It was from James. Ava found it in the mail pile and hesitated before handing it to me. Do you want me to open it first? I shook my head. If I'm strong enough to tell the story, I'm strong enough to face the echo. Inside was a single sheet of cream paper. No return address. Just his words. Mother, I saw the film. I heard your interview. I read what they wrote. I have no excuses. Only this. I didn't think it mattered. That's what shame does, it shrinks everything you touch. It tells you that what you're doing isn't abuse if no one sees it. It tells you love is something you can withhold like oxygen. I saw your eyes on that screen. I remembered what they used to look like when you read to me. I don't expect forgiveness. But I want you to know, you weren't invisible. I just refused to look. James. I sat with it for a long time. Not in tears. In stillness. Because pain has memory. But so does healing. I placed the letter in a drawer next to the court ruling Ava's first sketch of me reading in the garden and my original journal from the days of the recordings. I didn't write back. Some silences are necessary. Later that week, I brought the letter to our storytelling circle. I didn't read it aloud. Instead, I spoke about it. There are people who will never understand the damage they caused, I told the group. And there are others who realize it too late. But healing isn't about making them see you. It's about seeing yourself again and recognizing that you never disappeared. Joy squeezed my hand. Delia nodded silently, her lips trembling. And Ruth, who now wore lipstick like armor, said, "Closure doesn't come in envelopes. It comes in reflection." She was right. Forgiveness, I had learned, isn't something you owe. It's something you reclaim when the wound no longer bleeds, only pulses with memory. In mid-March, a mother and daughter pair joined the collective. Janice, the mother, had survived years of financial manipulation by her younger son. Her daughter Mara had fought the courts for custody after discovering her mother's home had been signed away without consent. They were tender together like survivors of a shipwreck who held each other not for comfort, but for orientation. In one session, Mara asked, "Do we ever stop reliving it?" I answered with a truth that had taken me a long time to arrive at. No, but it changes. At first, the memory is a room you're locked in. Then it becomes a hallway you pass through. And one day, it's just part of your house. You acknowledge it, but you don't live in it anymore. They cried. So did I. Because the truth has a way of pulling grief out from places we thought we'd sealed. That spring, our first national summit was announced. The Quiet Rebellion. A national gathering of survivor voices. Over 200 attendees signed up within the first 48 hours. Speakers included lawyers, trauma therapists, state representatives, and most importantly, survivors who'd never had a stage before. We booked a historic theater in Philadelphia. Ava created the artwork. A woman standing in profile, mouth open, but instead of sound blossoms spilled forth. Our tagline, "Not all silence is consent." I was asked to give the closing keynote. For weeks I wrestled with what to say. I'd already told my story, already fought the fight. What else was left? And then one night it came to me while writing by candlelight. You don't owe the world your trauma, but if you choose to share it, do so on your own terms. Not to prove you survived, but to show others they can. That became my opening line. April came, and the collective buzzed with preparation. Joy made her first speech outline. Ruth was curating an exhibit of survivor letters. Delia had crafted a spoken word piece so fierce it made the staff cry. I'd never felt more proud. Not of the work, but of the women. Each one had once whispered, "It wasn't that bad." Or, "Maybe it was my fault." Now they stood tall, names printed on programs, voices carrying in microphones. We weren't just a movement. We were a restoration, not of rights, but of self. Because in a world that still tells women to be quiet, to endure, to forgive, before they've even spoken, we had built something radical, a choir, and none of us were singing alone anymore. By the time April melted into May, our summit had taken on a life of its own. Volunteers poured in, some from colleges, some from senior centers, and others who had simply read a headline and felt compelled to act. We received a grant from a foundation that supported restorative justice. Ava and a small team set up a live stream so survivors around the world could attend even from hospital beds or nursing homes. The movement no longer needed introductions. It was rippling across continents. 2 days before I left for Philadelphia, I sat once more beneath the cherry tree in the garden, the same one I had first walked past with trembling legs all those months ago. It was in full bloom now, shedding petals with every breeze. I thought of the past year, James, the recordings, Thanksgiving, the arrest. Then I thought of Joy's first poem, of Ruth's emergency kit class, of Ava's gentle, persistent belief that I was more than a cautionary tale. And I realized this wasn't just my story anymore. It never had been. It belonged to every woman who had been told to smile through pain, to sit down when she needed to stand up to forgive, before she'd even named the wound. The morning of the summit, the theater buzzed like a heartbeat. Rows of seats filled with faces of every color, age, shape. Survivors, families, lawmakers, students. Some wore pins. Unheard no more. I am still here. Ask me my story. The walls were lined with our letters, the same ones from the wall of witness now framed in glass. When I stepped on stage, the room quieted. Not with pressure, but with reverence. I wasn't nervous, because I wasn't here to perform. I was here to pass the torch. I began softly. I was once a woman in a dark room with a cold plate of food and a silent scream. I thought I would die there, but instead I whispered, and that whisper became a record. That record became a truth, and that truth became a rebellion. I spoke for 20 minutes, not about James, about Ruth, about Ava, about the woman who wrote from Brazil thanking us for saving her grandmother. I said, silence is not weakness. It is a reservoir. When the dam breaks, the flood is not a disaster. It is a restoration. When I finished, the crowd rose. They clapped. Some wept. Some chanted. I stood there in that roar, not afraid, not ashamed, alive. After the summit, the press flooded in. We made headlines. The whisper that sparked a movement, NY Times. Elder Justice finds its voice. Washington Post. She survived her son's neglect. Now she's rewriting the law. NPR. Legislators began drafting new bills, stricter regulations for home caregivers, clearer pathways for anonymous reporting, stronger protections for elders who rely on family. But for me, the greatest victory came quietly. 2 weeks later, I received a small envelope from a woman named Lena. Inside was a photograph. She stood beside her grandmother, holding hands, both smiling wide. The grandmother's silver hair was tied back in a braid. On the kitchen table in front of them was a copy of our guidebook, dog-eared and marked with notes. Lena's note was short. You don't know us, but we are alive because you spoke. She almost didn't make it, but she did. We both did. I placed the photo in the resilience room beside the others. The wall was full now. Voices, faces, letters, photos, names. A constellation of survival. Later that month, Ruth and I sat by the garden's edge watching the last of the blossoms fall. Do you think we'll always carry it? She asked. The pain. No, she said. The knowing. The fact that we were left behind by the people we trusted most. I nodded slowly. Yes. But I think we get to decide how we carry it. In a locked drawer or in a book we pass forward. She smiled. Then I'll write a book. I'll be your first reader, I said. We laughed. Not to fill the space, but to honor it. Because the greatest revenge isn't rage. It's rebuilding. It's growing gardens over graves. It's turning silence into stories. And letting those stories live on. Summer returned in quiet triumph. There was no parade. No camera crews, no dramatic headlines, just warmth and breeze and the familiar sound of chairs being pulled onto the garden path as our circle gathered for one last meeting before the season changed. I sat at the edge of the group, not in the center anymore. That place now belonged to Ruth, who led the sessions with the ease of someone who had both lived and outlived her worst days. Her voice carried with calm authority, the kind born not of force, but of having earned every syllable. Our group had doubled in size. There were new faces. Teachers, social workers, former nurses, a retired judge. They came not only to speak, but to listen. The quiet collective had become more than a sanctuary. It was now a blueprint. and I was simply Margaret again. No longer the woman who exposed her son. No longer the face of elder justice. Just a woman who loved tea and morning light. Who sat with her story and let others hold it too. That afternoon, Ruth asked if I wanted to share something, one last reflection, before the group paused for the summer. I hesitated, then nodded. I reached into my bag and pulled out the original notebook, the one I'd written in while living under James's roof. The one with bent corners, with pages warped from silent tears. I hadn't opened it in almost a year. I held it in my lap and said, "This notebook once held everything I was too afraid to say out loud. I wrote in it because I thought no one would believe me. But now I know that truth doesn't rot in silence. It waits. It waits for courage, for witness, for a room like this." I opened to the first page and read aloud my very first entry. "He forgot my lunch again. My stomach is a tight knot. I dreamed of soup." The group sat in stillness. Delia bowed her head. Ruth closed her eyes. Joy reached for my hand. I looked up from the page. My voice was soft back then, I said, but not small. And then I smiled because something in me had finally fully settled. I was not just healed. I was whole. Ava came to visit that weekend. She brought a picnic basket and a tiny velvet box. "Don't get excited," she said with a grin. "It's not a diamond. It's better." Inside was a silver necklace, simple and elegant. Hanging from it was a single charm in the shape of a recorder, like the one I'd once used in secret. I laughed. "It's beautiful." She helped me put it on. "Your voice saved lives, Aunt Margaret," she said. "Now it can rest right where it came from." We sat under the cherry tree for a long time. No agenda, no planning, just the two of us breathing in the day. "I'm thinking of writing again," I said. Her eyes lit up. "A new book, not about pain, not about survival, just life. Stories that aren't warnings but invitations." She leaned her head on my shoulder. I'd read that she whispered, so I began again. Not in fear, in peace. Some days I still receive letters. Some are full of anguish, some gratitude. Some are confessions from abusers who watched the documentary and realized they had crossed lines they never named. Others are from daughters who finally asked their mothers, "Are you okay?" and learned the answer was no. Each letter reminds me, the work is never finished. But I've learned something else too. You don't have to finish the work to rest. You just have to carry your part well. And I have. The last page of my new journal is blank now, but I know how it will end. Not with a scream, not with revenge, but with a quiet image. A woman sits at her window, a teacup in one hand, a story in the other. She watches the wind move through the garden, through the petals and branches and light. And in the silence that surrounds her, there is no fear, only peace, and the memory of her own voice still echoing. Still here, still hers. Some stories don't end. They soften, they ripple, they pass from hand to hand like candles in the dark, never burning out, only changing shape. This story began in silence, the kind that suffocates, that hides bruises behind locked doors and hunger behind politeness. A son called himself a caregiver. A mother whispered her truth into an old phone, and from that whisper came fire. But fire isn't always destruction. Sometimes it's rebirth. Margaret Elowin didn't set out to be a hero. She simply refused to vanish. She chose to document her pain, not to punish but to preserve, not to expose but to survive. And in doing so, she reminded us of something timeless. That dignity is not granted. It's reclaimed. It's written in journal margins and typed in anonymous emails. It's whispered in group circles and spoken on stages. It's found in Ruth's survival kits, in Ava's sketches, in Joy's poems, in a million unheard voices that are finally being listened to. Grace's truth was never about revenge. It was about resurrection. The resurrection of self-worth, of voice, of the quiet power older women have always carried and the world has too often ignored. If you're reading this, or listening, or just sitting with your own memory, know this: your silence is not emptiness. It is gathering strength. And when you're ready, the world is too, so speak, not for vengeance, but for your name. Because your voice, no matter how quiet, is proof. You are still here. You always were.